I'm Ayli, and this is a BBSPN team guide to Amazons in Blood Bowl 2020. Amazons are a pretty ubiquitous team in Blood Bowl. They're a mainstay of tournament play and perform very well early on in league play. This is because every positional comes with a dodge, meaning your opponent is fishing for sixes on their blocking dice to knock you over early on. As teams develop and get tackle, Amazons can become vulnerable, but they are by no means bad or obsolete in these settings. Amazons are my personal favorite team in Blood Bowl, and while I enjoy a lot of the changes introduced in Blood Bowl 2020, I'm glad to see Amazons have stayed relatively the same from prior editions. Amazons have 4 positionals, all of which have the same stat lines, save for passing. Throwers have a 3-up passing stat, Linewomen have a 4-up, and the Blitzers and Catchers have a 5-up. All the other stats are the same across all positionals at 6-3, 3-up, 8-up. They also all have dodge, which is primarily why the team is so strong early in leagues. Really what separates these players are their skill accesses, and that's primarily what decides the differences in team builds. For this guide, I'm going to break down the builds first and then get into individual player level ups. Under most circumstances, I would talk about the player development before team builds, but for Amazons, I think knowing the builds first is important to understanding player development paths. Every Amazon team is going to take all 4 Blitzers. These are the linchpins to your strategy, and they start with block and dodge and have primary strength access. Amazons are a team that will want to get stuck in most matchups, so you will need that strength access to come out ahead on blocks. The only variability in builds I see comes from if you want the thrower and the catcher, or 2 catchers. Throwers, of course, are the only players on the team with primary passing access, and catchers are the only ones with primary agility access, so it's going to come down to if you value passing over a second agility access player. They also both cost 75k gold, so the same base builds work no matter which of these you take. If you go with 4 Blitzers and 2 of either positional, and then 6 Linewomen for 12 total players, you can get 3 rerolls and be 10k short of your Apothecary, so you'll probably put the last 40k into dedicated fans if you take that route. Alternatively, you could drop a Linewoman, get the Apothecary, and take 4 dedicated fans. I think this might be the better build for league play. You will be playing down going into the next drives in your first game, but you cannot afford to lose a Blitzer to a bad injury roll early on because they are so crucial. You could also play with 1 catcher and no thrower, and vice versa, but for league play I don't think that's very wise. The only benefit to this would be to start with 12 players and an Apothecary, but you're missing a positional and wouldn't have the money for dedicated fans, so your cash growth is slow. You're better off either being down the Apothecary first or starting with only 11 players. Personally, I would start with 11 players. Now let's go over player development. As an aside, I really dislike random skills on Amazons, especially with the Blitzers. These players are too crucial to risk getting a bad skill that you don't need early on, and they are expensive to replace. As for the rest of the team, the players are already very strong on their own, so I don't see a reason to take the shortcut and get a random skill when you could usually afford to wait to get the skills that make them the strongest. Therefore, I would recommend choosing skills on these players, and frankly, every player on this team. Let's start with the Blitzers. Blitzers are 90k, come with block and dodge, and have general and strength primary access, and you get 4 of them. You'll want to feed them touchdowns until they all have 1 or 2 skills to really kickstart their development. There's 2 ways to build Blitzers. The first is a guard piece. The second is a killer. Because Amazons want to brawl on the pitch, guard is the most important skill to have on this team. So I recommend taking that on the first 1 or 2 Blitzers that get to 6 SPP. After that, pick up Mighty Blow so you can get ahead on armor breaks and hopefully get a pitch advantage, which is often all Amazons need to really take over the game. Next, I would go for Stand Firm. It will keep your position when blocked, which is extremely important when Amazons get brawling. After guard, Mighty Blow, Stand Firm, you have a few different options for what you could take. Tackle is actually pretty reasonable in these types of players, especially if you want a frontline that can handle dodgy players, and this is what I go for most of the time here. While I've never personally used it, there are times where grab is unironically an awesome skill on a player like this, especially on a team that wants to deathball like Amazons. If neither of these sound appealing, you could also save up and try to get defensive or characteristic bonus. Strength up is incredible, but also incredibly expensive. Move up and agility up are very useful, and I'd take them when offered. Don't take the extra armor, and don't even think about a passing characteristic improvement. As for other secondary skills, the only one that could possibly be useful is Sidestep, but most of the time this is worse than Stand Firm. While I've personally played with a guard blitzer that has both Sidestep and Stand Firm, and it's very funny, it's not worth the TV or SPP investment to get it. Personally, I would take Tackle, and then seriously consider Grab or saving up for defensive or a characteristic improvement. There is a different way to develop a guard piece, and while I've never done it, coaches who are better than I am advocate for this when they struggle with offense, and I've met much more seasoned Amazon coaches than I am who swear on always having one of these. Take guard first, and then go for stand firm. After that, your next skill is frenzy. This player can surf in a pinch, but really what you're using frenzy for is to help reposition your blitzer when she's in a brawl. This is extremely useful and something I wish I had in most of my games, so I really recommend making a player this way. It slots into the team incredibly well. The other way to develop a blitzer is as a killer. While you can have a team that has 4 guard pieces for maximum death ball, I think this makes your team more one-dimensional than it has to be, and is an exploitable weakness. I'd rather have a killer with guard than a 4th dedicated guard blitzer. After you've gotten guard as the first skill on 1 or 2 blitzers, I'd start developing a killer. It's pretty standard early on, all things considered. Her first skill is going to be Mighty Blow to get her SPP without needing more touchdowns, allowing you to focus on scoring with an unleveled blitzer so you can get even more guard. After Mighty Blow, of course, comes Tackle, so you can more easily squash elves and stunties. From here you have several options, and it's largely a matter of preference. Guard as a 3rd level up can be incredibly powerful since it lets you leverage remaining movement after a blitz to set up good blocks elsewhere, and it will usually be relevant during the game, even if she's a backline sweeper against stunties and elves. In fact, depending on your league, Guard will be her 2nd skill, and you'll take Tackle on the next level up. Pro is awesome on a killer for this team, so you can fish for knockdowns with her. While I think some will look to Pile Driver as their next skill, I think that's a mistake here. Well, you could take it, and it could be good. This is a lot of team value to risk getting ejected from the game. I personally prefer having plenty of Mighty Blow when I can get it in this edition instead, but maybe Pile Driver is better than I give it credit for. For secondary skills, I really enjoy Jump Up. If you like Pile Driver, this is a must-take eventually, but it's also useful if your killer gets blitzed, because she can just make a block against whoever's based up against her, so you're still getting value without using your blitz. Sidestep actually is also fairly useful on a player like this, since it ensures you're always moving towards a valuable target, but it's a very small buff, and that's a lot of SPP for 1 extra space of movement sometimes. Personally, I pick Guard as my 3rd level up, followed by Pro, but regardless of what you take, this player is basically finished here, but she's a killer, so she'll keep getting SPP. This is when I start to seriously consider secondary or characteristic up. Anything but armor and passing are excellent. The only secondary I really consider is Jump Up, going back to that, but that's much more useful with Pile Driver. If you do decide to save for a characteristic, you're really hoping for Strength or Agility. Strength lets her blitz unassisted, which is definitely worth the 80k in team value, and Agility makes you far more mobile than AG 2+ blitzers on other teams because you start with dodge. Movement up is perfectly fine for the 20k TV and very useful. If you don't want to save up for a secondary characteristic up, I'd take one of the skills I suggested for 3rd level up that you didn't take already. Personally, I develop my killers as Mighty Blow, Tackle, Guard, Pro, characteristic up. Regardless, having a killer is necessary, and after Mighty Blow Tackle, you can take the player in a few directions to add some personal touches for how you like to play this team. Next, we're going to go over the Linewomen. These players are very efficient, coming in at 50k for average stats, save for the characteristically low armor, and come with dodge. They only have primary general access, with agility and strength for secondaries. They're pretty straightforward. Block is the most important skill here because it turns them into blodgers. From here you have a few options. The best choice, I think, is saving all the way to Guard to outbrawl the line of scrimmage, and I would definitely put a few Linewomen towards this. Tackle is useful to have against agility and stunty teams, and also gives another safety that isn't your killer. I usually get Tackle as the 2nd advancement on at least 1 Linewoman since it's so useful. Going to 2 is also totally fine. Kick is actually incredibly useful on this team, because you play the line of scrimmage so well that kicking it close is actually a really good way to disrupt your opponent before the game even starts. Sure Hands is pretty good if you wanted a dedicated carrier, but I really don't like this option. I see some people do this. Honestly, you have a thrower for a reason. The only other secondary skills I'd even consider would be Stand Firm, Defensive, or Sneaky Git, but you can get Guard for the same SPP cost, so I'm not sure why you would ever take Defensive. Block Stand Firm could be very useful, but I think a 4th or 5th Guard player is infinitely more useful than a 4th Stand Firm player. Sneaky Git is actually pretty great if you like fouling, and I'd make it the only skill this player ever gets, but 12 SPP is pretty far away for a fouler when Dirty Player exists for 6 SPP, and adds 20k less TV to a player who's liable to getting sent off the pitch. The other option is to take Block, and then immediately save for a characteristic up for the 2nd advancement, and this is actually pretty solid. Plus Agility gives you a really good ball carrier, Plus, strength gives you unassisted 2-die blitzes or a stronger LOS, but that's 80k to add on to a Linewoman, so I'm not sure why you would ever do this. This is something I'd consider on one Linewoman at most, to be totally frank. Because their base costs 50k, taking Dirty Player instead of Block gives you a 70k Fowler. I've done this before and it's fine, but I wouldn't call it a necessity, and I definitely wouldn't give her another advancement either. Some coaches swear by it, and it does let you get armor breaks much more frequently, because it lets you capitalize on having a pitch advantage if you ever get one, or it helps start one by just re-rolling armor on somebody. I personally am not a big fan of it. I've never personally gone with Wrestle instead of Block, which is something that some players also will swear by having at least 1 or 2 players for, and it's really good for crowd control. But, frankly, Blodge is also really, really good for crowd control, so I don't know why you would do this unless your league is not very good at playing defense and it's super easy to wrestle the ball free. While random general skills might be tempting, saving for the next 3 SPP required to guarantee block is just so much better that I don't think there's a world where you take random skills if you don't have to. Let's go over the catchers next. Catchers on this team have new life with a defensive skill, giving them extra flexibility and, more importantly, helping with your line of scrimmage brawling. Regardless, there's a lot of different directions you can take this player. The first skill for them is, of course, block. If you're looking for a player that will help with your blocks, defensive would be my next choice for skills, followed up by sidestep to keep them based when necessary. Of course, if you do go this route, you likely aren't actually passing to them very often because they're probably usually based up. While passing isn't very useful in Amazons, given the best passing stat they have is a 3-up, that is some utility you're giving up on, especially when you already pay for catch on this player. The other way I like to skill catchers is as markers. You'll get sidestep after block, and then you can follow it up with tackle or diving tackle, and then get the other after that. You could get tackle before sidestep depending on your league, but I really wouldn't get diving tackle before getting sidestep and tackle already. This is great for pinning down key players such as runners, catchers, or the ball carrier if you manage to poke a hole in their defense. If there's a big guy or strength 4 piece that doesn't have block or tackle, you can use these to lock them down for a few turns as well. These players can often end up in your opponent's backline, so you're not giving up on the catch skill either. I really like markers. Being able to keep a key player from moving and making it incredibly difficult for your opponent to move the ball is very important on an average speed bash team like Amazons, where you get stuck in early and often. Plus, they're useful as a backline sweeper if you don't think you can pin the player in the backfield, and with block and tackle, they can be your fairly effective blitzer in that role too. I would always have one of these players, and can frankly see having 2. The last way to develop them would be a dedicated catcher, but honestly, I think this is a waste of the player's potential. If you are going to do this, you're going to need to decide what to prioritize. Sure Feet and Sprint make them faster, more consistently at least, for if you've potatoed the ball with your pass. Safe Pair of Hands is actually fairly useful if you're running the ball with protection, but I don't consider this a must. Diving catch giving a +1 to catch is very useful, and sometimes you'll get the ball in hilarious fashion when your opponent fumbles it. Honestly, diving catch might be the most useful one. Again though, I don't really recommend making these dedicated catchers. I'd rather have diving catch instead of diving tackle on a marker catcher if you need a catching skill, so that you have a good target for passing when you need to, but it's not a player who's only useful at catching the ball on the off chance you do pass. Also, if they just so happen to trip the runner, it's very funny to see them catch the ball off of it. Speaking of passing, the thrower is the last position on this team. Really what you're using her for is leader to get an extra discounted reroll, a sure hands player if that's something you really want, and most importantly, yet another blodger. Once you've got block and leader, there's a slew of relevant passing skills she can get as she gets more SPP. Not a passing skill, but still important though, sure hands is incredibly useful, and this is the only player I'd really ever take it on this team, so be sure to get it. Especially so you can deal with those pesky strip ball leapers. Accurate or Cannoneer first is really up to you and how you see yourself playing. Cannoneer notably takes long passes to a -1 modifier, which means she passes on a 4-up with a skill reroll. That's a pretty good passing range that only requires a 4+, which it's not the best passing in the game, but that's still entirely reasonable. Fumblerooski is actually fairly interesting on this player, and I can see coaches taking it to open up some interesting positioning plays with handoffs. It opens up a lot of flexibility, so I actually like the skill a lot. For the most part, you could take random passing skills after block, leader, and sure hands, and as long as you don't get Hail Mary pass or Cloudburster, the skill will have use. That's really about it for throwers. They are first and foremost a blodge leader caddy, and then they can be a mediocre thrower. Frankly though, you might be better off just treating her as a glorified Linewoman with leader, and taking tackle as the third skill instead, or maybe even the fourth skill, so that you can still take sure hands. That's a really solid addition to the lineup if you're not willing to invest in more passing skills, because Amazons already have such mediocre passing game that investing more into it doesn't make it all that much better. That's up to you though. In terms of models, because Games Workshop hasn't given us official models for Amazons yet outside of the made-to-order batch that closed a few months ago, you really need to find a third-party source for them or make your own. If you want to stay entirely within Games Workshop, you can convert some of the Necromunda Escher, and this is usually the most common way to kitbash them. If you want feathery bits, ask your local Age of Sigmar Tzeentch player for some of the Carrick Acolyte feathers that are available in that kit. They're purely aesthetic. Most of the time, they've probably used them, but they might have some left over, or maybe they just didn't use them at all. The knives in the Escher kit can also make really good knuckle dusters, and will look a lot better if you're good with green stuff. If you're not, that's okay too, they can still look fine, but if you are good with green stuff, definitely give them that nice gauntlet. Actual footballs for the miniatures are available in a myriad of Blood Bowl kits, actually all of them, so just ask around for those or use some of the ones that you have laying around. Just remember when kitbashing your own teams to pay special attention to what positional each individual model is, so that when the team is finished, you've implemented design elements that make it easy to differentiate positionals on the pitch via shared themes. Give your blitzers a consistent design element that is unique to them. Same for the throwers and the catchers. I recommend Spubba's modeling tips on the NAF website for more specific information. This type of kitbash is usually the most common way to make them wholly within Games Workshop's materials. For third-party miniatures, the North Warriors Kickstarter from Punga Miniatures is still accepting late backers at time of recording. If you're seeing this later, don't worry. Punga Miniatures sells everything on their website after and keeps it within regular production. Greebo Games Carry Mat miniatures are top of the line and now coming in Greebo Special Greeblood resin instead of white metal very soon. Currently they're out of stock while they make that transition, but the quality of Greebo's sculpts is really only matched by Punga, and Greebo's quality is well spoken for in the community, so they are well worth the wait. Greebo also has the added bonus of having a small team booster to give you aesthetically matching positionals to run the team as Norse, which is a lot of bang for your buck. Playing Amazons is pretty straightforward. If you're against dwarves, you're gonna have a bad time. Dwarves is less bad, but still rough, and they have plenty of AV 8-up hobgoblins for you to pulverize to hopefully keep the pitch even while they tackle and mighty blow your team. Against not tackle, once you have enough blodge to consider it spamming, you want to base up against your opponent hyper-aggressively while rolling over them with guard support. Target key players with your killer or bully out-of-position players. Other than that, you don't have many tricks up your sleeve, so you're at the mercy of both the dice and your skill as a coach. If you get a pitch advantage, you're going to start steamrolling if you position properly, and I cannot emphasize enough how the positioning game is probably the single most important part to playing Amazons. You have to know how to position your team. Not just around your guard players, but also around what your opponent can do, how fast their team is, and what their skills are too. Positioning is the key to Amazons. Generally speaking, your team plays better as a death ball, but with a pitch advantage, you'll often find yourself actually splitting up the enemy team based upon the position of your guard players to divide them while holding the strength advantage and making it so that they can't get that advantage back. Essentially, you want to shut down as many favorable blocks as you can. Of course, all of this is context dependent, so use your better judgment. It's easier to learn a team by seeing someone playing it or playing it yourself, so try the team out and play the pitch in the most unfair way possible. I'm Ayli, and this is BBSPN's Guide to Amazons. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the content, you should really subscribe to us. My take on this kind of content is much different from Josh's, but I think they complement each other fairly well. Our podcast is basically two 20-somethings gushing about all things Blood Bowl, trying new and weird stuff in the game, with a healthy mix of vulgarity added. Our social media is in the description, along with our Discord server link, and we would love to have you in it. We do Blood Bowl 2 and Tabletop Simulator leagues and pickup games, including Sevens and Dungeon Bowl if you're so inclined. So come by, say hello, and stay for a few games. We'd love to have you.